Yes, it is.
Hey, how are you today?
Pretty good.
Great, great. I'm actually going to be near where you live in about a month and a half.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I come to, I do a big, long Pacific trip, and it starts on Oahu. So, what part of Oahu do you live on?
I live in Kailua.
Oh, okay, yeah, nice. I'm actually planning to go do a hike up near there. They call it the Bunker Hike.
Oh, cool.
Anyway, so your work is on the atomic bomb, I guess.
Yes.
Quite a subject.
Mhm.
Uh, Okay, how about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. There we go. So where were we? So the subject of atomic bomb. I sent you that one paper I had written a long time ago about it.
Yeah, I've read through that.
And I don't know if you had a chance to look at that, but that lays out some of the bigger issues. And I don't know what part of the story you're going to tackle with your work, but I imagine the question that often comes up is whether or not it was right or wrong to use the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
Is that something you're going to take on?
Yeah, that's the main focus of my project.
I had a feeling that might be the case, yeah. So what do you feel about that question so far?
I feel that there were better ways to handle it, but in the situation that President Truman was given, there weren't very many options for him.
Yeah, I like to point out to people that Truman did have one option, and that was he could have continued, or he could have gone with the Navy's recommendation. Particularly Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz was proposing the naval blockade, and the Japanese home islands had already been subjected to blockade. And just to illustrate the difficulty of the situation, if the Navy, it's believed now that if the naval blockade had continued, it would have continued. It wouldn't have been a matter of 2 or 3 months. It would have gone on for probably a year, and that during that time, the result would have been starvation for, it's been estimated, 1 million Japanese people. So the option, this issue of there were other options, there were, and they were, I believe, worse.
Yes.
Because certainly starving 1 million people to death slowly but surely over the course of 14 or 15 months is worse than suddenly incinerating 200,000 people with atomic bombs. Another option that often gets brought up too is the option of not atomic bombs, but rather continuing with the use of conventional weapons, and that presents problems too, because the use of conventional bombing, and I think you probably read a little bit about firebombing raids over cities in Japan, the most notable of which was an operation called Operation Meeting House. And Operation Meeting House took place the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945. And that was a large-scale firebombing raid against the Sumida district of the city of Tokyo. And one of the things that is worth pointing out about Operation Meeting House is that it killed 120,000 people just through firebombing. And that's a number that is greater than the loss of life in Hiroshima.
Yes.
The point being that when we decades later attend that decision, I think it's important for people to understand it in a greater context. By the time that the first bomb was dropped, Japanese cities had been completely destroyed by conventional bombing. And I have found that the debate about whether or not it was right to use the atomic bomb, the debate often overlooks that point. And the reality of the situation was that the Japanese had been subject to intense bombing with extreme high loss of civilian life for months and months on end before the atomic bombs occurred. And in a way, we often like to indicate President Truman's relationship to the bombing. And President Truman was in a position to exert, of course, presidential authority over the continued bombing campaign. But in reality, what the president did was he continued a policy that already existed before he became president, because it was the entire thing was set in motion by President Roosevelt's policy decisions, and President Roosevelt's policy decision was to pursue an end to the war that would result in an unconditional surrender. And you might have heard of this thing that takes place just outside of Berlin on July 14th through 19th, 1945, called the Potsdam Conference. And it was the first conference of all the Allied military and political leaders that occurred after the war in Europe ended. And at the Potsdam Conference, President Truman was asked, because President Truman had only just become president, and he was asked whether his policies toward war with Japan would be different than his predecessors. And President Truman, in what we now call the Potsdam Proclamation, said that he would pursue an unconditional surrender. In other words, he was saying, I will continue the policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And part of that was this bombing campaign. And the bombing campaign was the continuation. It wasn't suddenly something new that just started with Truman. The bombing campaign began when President Roosevelt was still alive and still president. And so President Truman continued that campaign. There's a fascinating moment, though, I should point out, that, we considered using the third bomb. I don't know if that's a well-known fact, but Hiroshima occurs on August 6th, Nagasaki occurs on August 9th. In the time period between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declares war on the Empire of Japan. And that is a critical moment because the emperor, upon hearing news that the Soviet Union declared war, those that were in the room, the Japanese military and civilian cabinet members that were in the room with the emperor, they all mentioned that they could see him turn white at the news that the Soviet Union had declared war. And then the following day, when news came in about the bombing of Nagasaki, that's when the emperor intervened, because I don't know if you understand that the detail is that the Japanese surrender, it didn't happen instantly. It was a sequence of events set in motion when Emperor Hirohito intervened in the cabinet meeting of, it would be August the 11th, 1945, Tokyo time, August 10th, in Honolulu in Washington, D.C. But the process of moving toward the negotiated peace, the ceasefire, and then ultimately the surrender, that process took weeks. And during that time, we continued bombing. I find sometimes that people aren't aware of that people think that immediately after the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, the war came to an end. That is not what happened. In fact, there was, you're familiar with the fact that we recognize August 15th as VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. That's the point at which we consider the war against Japan as having ended, but that's really the point at which the ceasefire took effect. Then there was a negotiated surrender agreement that was signed in Tokyo Bay September 2nd, 1945. But between Nagasaki and August 15th, so between August 9th and August 15th, the bombing continued. There were 2 days where our bombers did not operate, and then and it was because the Japanese backed away from negotiations. So when the emperor intervened in the cabinet meeting of 5, he instructed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to reach out to the United States through the neutral party, which was the government of Switzerland. And we received these indications from the Swiss government that Japan wanted to talk about terms. And when that news reached the White House, President Truman then said, we will accept only an unconditional surrender. And the Japanese didn't immediately provide a response. So, in other words, on August, that would be 11th Tokyo time, 10th in Honolulu, Washington, D.C., the Japanese received this. We received a notice from the Swiss government that the Japanese want to negotiate. We stop all of our bombing activity for 2 days. The president responded immediately saying the only terms we will offer will be unconditional surrender. And the Japanese don't respond. On the 3rd day, with no Japanese response, the United States just assumes that they no longer want to consider peace terms, and we resume bombing. We have 3 solid days of bombing activity until finally the Japanese, well, I shouldn't say finally, we accept the term, because people frequently mention that at the end of World War II, an unconditional surrender was that the Japanese surrendered unconditionally, and that is not true, because the Japanese surrender was conditional, and it was really only one meaningful condition, and it was that the emperor would remain the figurative head of state, meaning that the emperor would not be subjected to a war crimes trial. He wouldn't be treated like a war criminal. So, when the U.S. didn't receive a response from the Japanese for 2 days, we resumed bombing, and the bombing continues up until the final moment when the United States agrees to allow the emperor, which is during the day that's August 15th, Tokyo time. There were actually bombers in the air that had just bombed the oil fields at Akita on northern Honshu during that day. So there were bombers in the air when technically the ceasefire went into effect and the war came to an end. So we bombed Japan with conventional weapons for months and months and months, destroyed 68 cities. Then there were 2 atomic bombs. And then we briefly continued bombing Japan, and then the war ended. And the arguments about whether it was right or wrong, and the arguments about what other options were available, I think typically overlook the fact that it was a campaign that had gone on. The first Allied bombs fell on Japan, forgetting, of course, the Doolittle raid in 1942. But the first Allied bombs began falling on cities in Japan in August of 1944, with B-29s flying from bases in China. The campaign is not really effective and it's not really accurate until Operation Meeting House, which was low-level incendiary bombing or firebombing that begins in March of 45. A big point that I like to make is that the Japanese government and the emperor himself were willing to accept civilian casualties, and that the Japanese government and the emperor himself were well aware of the high casualty levels. After Operation Meeting House, the bombing raid on Tokyo, March 9th and 10th, 1945, the emperor himself went out and toured the destruction to the Sumida district of the city, which had been completely destroyed by one big fire. And the emperor saw piles of bodies, he saw bodies floating in the river, and the emperor had to accept those casualties, and Japan continued on. And so when we consider other options, there was the option of continuing the bombing campaign without the use of nuclear weapons. I'm not convinced that it would have really made a dramatic difference. And then the option of carrying out a naval blockade, which I believe would have starved 1 million people to death, which I think is far crueler than the way that the war actually ended.
Yeah.
And I'm actually glad that a decision was made not to do that, because had there been widespread starvation in Japan, I don't think there could have been any remote possibility of a sudden transition to a peaceful wartime aftermath. And that's what we got. It was because of the fact that the United States government agreed to the condition to allow the emperor to continue serving. And that condition, I think, was absolutely critical to paving the way for a peaceful post-war time period. And because I've spent an entire lifetime studying the subject, the atomic bomb, it's a subject that I'm very interested in. I spent a lot of time in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the places where the atomic bomb was built in the United States. And when I look back on it, I tend to think things could have ended so much worse than they did. Not that I'm trivializing the lives of the people who were killed as a result of strategic bombing, because I'm not. But that war, if it had continued on, if the naval blockade had continued, there would have been widespread starvation. And then in addition to that, the Soviet Union would have begun fighting, and the Soviet Union would have become suddenly a meaningful presence in war in the Japanese home islands. You may be aware that the Soviet Union actually did conduct an amphibious landing on Hokkaido.
Yeah, I've heard about
at the very end of the war. Yeah. And one thing that we now know is that you can look at the way that the Soviets treated Berlin at the end of World War II, and that is that they treated it like a bunch of savages. And I think they would have done the same thing to Japan. And I believe that is probably why the emperor decided to end the war when he did. So we can talk about whether or not it was right or wrong to use the atomic bomb. I think it actually might not matter that much, because when the emperor decided to intervene in the cabinet meeting of August 11, 1945, Tokyo time, August 10th in Honolulu and Washington, I think that the emperor was not thinking in terms of these terrible, awful bombs that the Americans are using. I have to stop it. I think the emperor was actually responding to and reacting to the Soviet declaration of war. I mean, if I had to identify one single thing, but it's a bigger picture than just that. He wasn't considering just one thing. He was considering a variety of things. And I think principal among them was the fact that he realized the Soviets are against us now, and we just can't stand up and fight a multi-front war against the two most powerful nations on the planet simultaneously, and one of those nations has this new powerful bomb. I started to tell you the story about the third bomb, and I wanted to just finish that point real quick, if you don't mind listening. And that's because I mentioned how after Nagasaki there was a 2-day pause on aerial combat operations and no bombing took place. But then we resumed heavy bombing activity. And when we resumed heavy bombing activity, President Truman think of it like a menu. He had a menu from which he could choose about what to do. And this was, of course, days after Nagasaki. And the choice that the president, among the choices that were offered to the president, were no more bombing of any kind, naval blockade. We could resume conventional heavy bombing activity, meaning go back to just bombing with conventional bombs and fire bombs, or we can drop a third atomic bomb, because there was, at that stage, enough fissile material, meaning the explosive core of a nuclear weapon. There's enough on Tinian in the Marianas to assemble a third bomb. And when the president was considering those options, he asked the War Cabinet, well, if we get a third, it was General Spaatz, who was 20th Air Force Commanding General. General Spaatz said, well, if we proceed with another atomic, what target do we strike? And they were actually considering the sacred city of Kokura, which had not been bombed yet by anything. and it's, of course, a World Heritage Site. It's one of the most incredible places on planet Earth. And there was a discussion about whether or not to drop an atomic bomb on it. And as that discussion played out, it finally came down to whether or not it would receive presidential authorization, the idea of a third atomic bomb on Kokura. And when they turned to the president to authorize it, the president's exact words were, "I've killed enough women and children." So the presidential legacy has been one where we think, oh, President Truman is this butcher that dropped atomic bombs on women and children. But the reality is that the president was just continuing a policy of his predecessor. And then, after 2 atomic bombs, the president he backed off. He backed off of the idea of using another atomic bomb. The irony of that is that he backed off of using an atomic bomb, but then continued using the conventional bombs. And an argument that I make on this subject frequently is that it's almost irrelevant. I think it's irrelevant whether or not the bomb was atomic or TNT, whether it was a nuclear weapon or a conventional weapon. Those weapons were being used against the Japanese. They've been used against the Japanese for a year at that point. It was actually over a year at that point. And although the weapons had destroyed cities and destroyed infrastructure and destroyed roads, Japan was still quite confident that it could continue resisting. And we know now for a fact that if Japan had not surrendered when it did, that an Allied invasion of Japanese home islands would have been disastrous for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Because if we had proceeded, you probably heard how we have this argument that pops up every time this comes up. The invasion of the Japanese home islands would have killed 1 million Americans. And that's definitely not true. That there's a great debate about casualty estimates for an invasion of the home islands. It probably would have been a lot less than 1 million. It probably would have been a lot less than 500,000. But that doesn't matter because it didn't happen. If it had happened, the real tragedy, it would have been a tragedy on all sides, because the tragedy would have been, I think, we would have suffered 250,000 casualties. That's not just killed, that's killed, wounded, and missing. Probably 150,000 killed in action. And then another 100,000 wounded. It would have been tragic for those Americans to lose their lives. If there had been an invasion of the Japanese home islands, there would have been an enormous loss of civilian life, comparable to the loss of civilian life on Okinawa during the 90 days of the Okinawa campaign. And I think it's a good thing that those lives were not lost. But it's not a good thing that lives were lost as a result of strategic bombing in World War II. I find that people tend to focus on Hiroshima and Nagasaki alone, and they forget things that happened to cities like Toyama or Nagoya or Osaka, and they forget about what happened to Tokyo, because Tokyo was there was almost nothing standing in the waterfront districts in that city by the time that the war ended. And that's why I encourage people to consider the fact that there was this significant conventional bombing campaign that came before the atomic bombs and then continued briefly after the atomic bombs.
Yeah.
There was a brief moment when the president considered using a third bomb. He decided not to do that. And that ended up paying powerful dividends, because by pausing long enough, it allowed the emperor to consider his options. And the emperor was facing the continuation of this terrible American air campaign, and then also the sudden introduction of Soviet ground fighting forces. And he recognized, I believe correctly, that if the Soviets invaded the Japanese home islands, there would be no stopping them. And the Soviets, unconcerned with sustaining casualties among their fighting forces, the Soviets would have waged a war against the Japanese people that would have been brutal and unrelenting, and the loss of life would have been biblical.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's not that it's a good thing, but the war could have ended with so much more loss of life, so much more destruction. The debate to this day, it remains sort of a contested debate in that within the academic community there's a tendency to recognize that the United States only used the atomic bomb. There's an old theory that the U.S. used the atomic bomb not to destroy Japan, but to send a message to the Soviet Union. And I don't believe that's what was going on. There was also a period where there was a racialized debate relating to the atomic bomb. It's largely abandoned now. People don't often talk about it. But the debate went like this. It suggested that the United States used the atomic bomb against the Japanese because the United States was, in its nature, racist and chauvinistic and prejudicial against Asian people. And I don't believe that was the case, because we had one of the biggest allies who fought alongside us throughout the Second World War was an Asian nation, the biggest of them all, in fact, China.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, when it comes down to the total number of civilian lives lost, this is a very important point. The total number of civilian lives lost to strategic bombing during World War II. There's one country that has the highest loss rate, and it's Germany. 770,000 German civilians were killed as a result of Allied strategic bombing. That's American and British strategic bombing during World War II. And the number of Japanese civilians killed as a result of strategic bombing is less than half that number. It's around, we believe, 730,000. I'm sorry. The number of Japanese is around 330. The number of Germans is 770,000. The old racialized debate was that Americans never would have dropped an atomic bomb on white people. And the reality is, yes, we would have. And we wouldn't have hesitated. It's just that the war ended before the bomb was ready. And when it comes down to it, Allied forces killed many, many more white people than they did Asian people. And if you want to be particular about this, the true killer of Asian people during the Second World War was the Empire of Japan. The Japanese killed far more Chinese people than the United States killed of Japanese people. But those are just points that I like to bring up. That's the state of the debate. So you have people that believe the United States was completely and fully justified in using the bomb. You have people that believe the United States was racist for using a terrible weapon against Asian people. And then you have people that believe that the United States dropped the bomb only to send a message to the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And I would encourage you to read every book ever printed on this subject and decide for yourself.
So, I have just one question. How long was the plan to drop the bomb in place from President Truman?
Well, the plan to drop the bomb was in place before Harry Truman became President of the United States. The plan to drop the bomb, you have to understand that it was contingent. It was sort of an if factor. During President Roosevelt's administration, when President Roosevelt was still alive, he authorized this project, the Manhattan Project, which I'm sure you're familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
which was the project to develop the atomic bomb. He then further authorized the U.S. Army to develop an Air Force special group, the 509th Composite Group, and that group was going to be the group that would drop an atomic bomb once the atomic bomb is completed. This was done in 1942. In fact, you probably have heard the name Paul Tibbets before, and Paul Tibbets was the pilot of the B-29 that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. His B-29's name was Enola Gay. And Tibbets flew that mission. He was the commander of the 509th Composite Group, which was the group that trained to deliver atomic bombs, I interviewed him before his death and asked him about this issue and asked him what he thought about the opposing arguments about the atomic bomb. And he pointed out that the first training operation that the 509th Composite Group flew, once they were formed, and they were formed in 1943, that once they were formed and they had airplanes, the first training mission that they flew was a simulated bomb attack on the city of Berlin. And so as early as 1943, the United States is rehearsing to use a bomb that wasn't developed yet, a bomb that was still under development. And then, as you already know, that bomb, it was theoretically usable in late 1944, because, there are two different bombs. There's a uranium-235 device called the Little Boy. That was the weapon that was used against Hiroshima. Mm-hmm. And then there was a plutonium implosion method device that was used over Nagasaki. It was called Fat Man. Mm-hmm. And you probably there's some famous footage of Fat Man being wheeled out of the shed where it was assembled on Tinian. You've probably seen that footage, but mm-hmm. Theoretically, the uranium-235 gun device, as they called it, the Hiroshima bomb, on paper, it was very convincing that the weapon would definitely work, and they believed before January 1st, 1945, that it would work. They just didn't test it, but all of the physicists that were associated with the Manhattan Project were in agreement it's going to work. They just hadn't done an actual live test. The plutonium implosion method device, which is the Fat Man bomb used on Nagasaki, the scientists that worked on that weapon were divided, with half of them saying this is definitely going to work, with the other half believing that it might not work. This might not be a functioning method of achieving fission. And so, to test that, just to be on the safe side, you might be aware that they conducted a test July 16, 1945 at Alamogordo, New Mexico, called Trinity.
Yeah.
And the Trinity test was, as you know, I've been to the Trinity site. That's an amazing place to go visit. But Trinity was a successful test. It proved that the plutonium method, which was the disputed method, it proved that the plutonium method was definitely going to work. And we already had every indication that the uranium-235 gun device, the Hiroshima bomb, the bomb casing actually has a 50 caliber gun barrel down the middle of it that fired a depleted uranium projectile, a 50 caliber uranium bullet down this barrel into a fissile or weapons grade uranium core, and that achieved fission. They already knew that was going to work. There was no question. It was empirical. But then with Trinity, they had proof that the plutonium implosion method device was going to work as well. And that was, remember the date for Trinity is July 16, 1945. So by July 16, we had proof that even the questionable bomb was definitely going to work.
Yeah.
So if you back the timeline up to when did the United States decide that we would use an atomic bomb, we decided long before we had a functioning atomic bomb. In fact, not quite 2 years, but almost 2 years before a bomb was ready to be dropped. And we had a special squadron that was rehearsing for it. Here's a fascinating detail that it interests me very much, and since you're interested in this subject, it might appeal to you as well. The 509th Composite Group, which was the group, there was only one group that would fly the B-29s to drop the atomic bombs. And, those aircraft, they were specially modified to where they could drop an atomic bomb. The aircraft had to be modified internally. They had special extended range fuel tanks for the aircraft. The bomb bays were modified because, B-29s have 2 bomb bays, and they had to enclose one bomb bay to make an internal secondary, an alternative fuel tank system. So there's another I think, 1,200 gallons of fuel that was in the forward bomb bay on all of the 509th Composite Group B-29s. And if you, they were given the project, the 509th Composite Group was given the code name Silver Plate. And so there were, I think, 24 B-29s that were modified to carry the atomic bomb. So they were all called Silver Plate B-29s. And so the Silver Plate aircraft got detained shortly after, the United States Marine Corps captures 10 men from the Japanese in a brief but effective battle in late July, early August 1944. And within a month, they began building what became eventually the busiest airport on planet Earth, Northfield 2. For about 13 months, it was the busiest airport in the entire world. And the 509th Composite Group moved there very soon after. So they were there before January. I don't know the exact date the group arrived. I think it might have actually even been in September. And flying practice missions needed. And when I say fly, they say practice missions, what I mean is that they flew against targets in the Japanese home islands. And when they flew them, they're flying with these modified B-29s. Aircraft with atomic bombs. They were so modified that they couldn't fly at normal bombing rates because all of the bomb shackling bomb bays pulled out of the aircraft. This was replaced by shackling for the special atomic bomb casings. And they also had shackling for the practice bombs. The pumpkin bomb. And if you haven't read about pumpkin bombs yet, the pumpkin bomb was a conventional TNT bomb, free-fall bomb, that mimicked the size and shape of what we thought the atomic bomb would be when they were built. Because again, we put together the special squad, moved them all the way out to Marion Island, and we're not sure, by the time they moved there, we weren't sure that we had a bomb ready yet, and we weren't sure that we were going to have a bomb ready. It depended on a very, very large number of things. And nevertheless, the 509th Composite Group, in anticipation of having a functioning atomic bomb, began flying these practice missions where they would take off the team, fly 1,300 miles to the Japanese home islands, fly over a target, and then drop these pumpkin bombs. And the pumpkin bombs, they were big enough to mimic an atomic bomb, and they carried, I think it's either 8,000 or 9,000 pounds of TNT conventional explosive. And so the 509th Composite Group, long before the training was tested, was flying missions to Japanese home islands and dropping pumpkin bombs. So that once the bomb was finished, they would do that. That was a long way of getting to the answer to your question. When did we decide to drop the bomb? Well, President Roosevelt decided that the policy of the United States would be to engage the Empire of Japan in warfare until such time as we could receive an unconditional surrender. And that included a bombing campaign. That bombing campaign began as a conventional bombing campaign in August of 1944 and continued on all the way to the atomic bombs and beyond. So for everything to come together on August 6, 1945 over Hiroshima, it took years of effort, it took billions of dollars, and it took two presidents. We sometimes like to indicate Harry Truman as being sort of the most important character in this story, and in reality, I think it's actually Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt is the person who authorized the policies of the way that we would conduct war with Japan, and that continued all the way past his death because Harry Truman really just continued his policies.
Okay, I think that is all that I have today.
Well, I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that's about answered all the questions that I need to fill in the blanks for my research paper.
Well, if you need anything else before History Day, let me know. If you need anything written, or if you need reference on books, or if you need photographs, let me know. I have all of those things. This is a subject I spend most of my time working with, and I've been to all the sites that are associated with this story, to include Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome. Good luck.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Sure. Bye-bye now.